To be one of my favorite government institutions. They do some real work that real scientists and engineers can use every day. So I'm looking forward to this particular interview. Adam, take it away.
At the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard, and I'll be speaking again tomorrow. In today's discussion, I wanted to discuss with Jeremy Grant the following. In 2011, President Obama launched an effort he called the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. In setting up the effort, he cited the billions of dollars of cost lost to internet fraud and identity theft every year. He also said the potential for fraud and the weakness of privacy protections often leave individuals, businesses, and governments reluctant to conduct major transactions online. The vision that he outlined included this language: imagine a world where individuals can conduct sensitive business transactions online with reduced fear of identity theft or fraud and without the need to manage scores of usernames and passwords. At the same time, individuals will retain their existing options of anonymity and pseudo-anonymity internet transactions. Jeremy Grant, our guest today, is the Senior Executive Advisor to INSTIC. And today we'll talk to him about the effort, how it could transform how we use the internet in the future. So the first question I wanted to ask is, if you imagine some years hence, you're invited back to the White House, you receive a medal of distinction for your great effort because you've achieved the goal that you set out to do. What will you have achieved? What will it look like to the users, all of us?
Wow, a medal, that would be something.
A gold medal.
I think what it will look like is you'll see several years from now, you will see a vibrant marketplace where everybody in the country can choose within a marketplace from a variety of accredited solutions that they can use online every place that they go for identity and authentication in lieu of managing 25 or 30 different passwords in a way that's much more secure, much more convenient, much more privacy enhancing than what they have today.
But specifically, how will that work?
So, well, how it works is something that's being worked out right now. I should note NSTIC is the S is for strategy, and it lays out a vision for the future. It doesn't say every step about how we get there, but it does identify several key steps that we need to take. How it would work, the easiest way I would describe it, how would we actually come up with a vibrant marketplace where we could go to many different places that we do business with online. I could even go to patient privacy rights who might choose to offer a product like this for patients in the marketplace. If I get one, the question would then be who would accept it? Why would they accept it? In order to do that, you really need to have a trust mark, essentially, some sort of, and it could be, by the way, a visual or something that's machine readable or either, that would be backed by a set of standards and operating rules that would ensure interoperability and acceptance of this credential any place that took a site, any place that you'd visit that would accept credentials. The easiest way to talk about the trust mark concept is to I always look at the bank card network. So I have 2 Visa cards in my wallet right now. One's from Chase and one's from US Bank. If I go out to the coffee shop across the street and buy a cup of coffee, they could care less who the issuing bank is because that card has the Visa logo on it. And it's not just a bunch of ink. It stands for a whole bunch of standards and rules, including how the card is actually produced and what security protocols apply to it, how the card's authenticated at the point of sale, how many days it will take for the merchant, Starbucks, to actually get paid for my purchase, what the interchange fee will be for actually using that network. And some would argue, a lot of lawyers would argue in particular, most importantly, that if Adam here steals my card and buys Starbucks for everybody here, and I look at the charge later in the month and go, I didn't do that, there's rules that are in place that actually allocate liability between the consumer, the issuer of the card, and the merchant, with the merchant taking most of the loss, but there's at least rules that are there that ensure a basis for predictability. Online today, we don't have that. You're starting to see some firms, say like Google, Facebook, offer federated login, but most of the schemes that are out there are really sort of company specific. There aren't rules, for security or privacy that I think most consumers would say they find meaningful, and there really isn't there's no foundation for interoperability. We're starting to see some of that emerge right now, a lot of it influenced and driven by NSTIC, but there's a lot of work to go to enable that medal I'm going to get, I guess.
But I'm still not sure I understand. I want to go today and do some online banking. Then I want to visit my doctor and get some latest report. Then I want to do something else, buy something on the internet. Am I presenting some kind of token to create those transactions, a number, and then I have to double authenticate? What exactly am I doing in the future for which this metal is dependent? In manifest form, what is it exactly?
So the answer is it could be several things. One of the things, when you're asking sort of what technology am I using, and one of the things that the White House did when they were putting the strategy together back in 2010, early 2011, was specifically decided not to mandate any particular technology or approach. The reason being that there's simply too much innovation, too many entrepreneurs in the space who are coming up with really good ways to authenticate online. The worst thing we could do would be to do what a lot of other countries have done and said, hey, we'll just do a smart card, or we'll just give you a key fob, or it'll just be an app for your smartphone. The idea was, let's actually talk about the outcomes we're looking to achieve and realize that there's going to be a lot of different technologies, including ones we probably haven't even thought of, that will enable this sort of secure, privacy-enhancing experience. So, what could it be? You might choose to get a smart card. You might choose to get a dongle. I think most people are probably going to get something that's bound to their mobile device simply because that's where we're seeing the most innovation these days. Certainly every month we have new companies coming into our office who have developed, what I call another widget that's a great way to authenticate and identify yourself online. And our take is great. We love seeing these things. Here's the NSTIC and the principles that stand behind it. We hope you'll choose to follow them and get involved in this broader effort. But the fact that there's innovation going on right now and people thinking of better ways to do it than what we've seen in the marketplace to date, a lot of which consumers frankly haven't been enamored with, that's what we really want to drive as a marketplace that supports innovation but also is consistent with these guiding principles.
Recently you told the Wall Street Journal that passwords are awful and they need to be shot. Why do you favor the capital punishment for a password?
Yeah, so it was fun. I had both the Wall Street Journal and CBS Evening News said, oh, we got to get that guy saying this on the news that night. Both were 20-minute interviews where they actually whittled me down to the exact same quote, and I sounded like a very violent person. The broader quote was talking about the history of passwords and noting that in 2004, Bill Gates said passwords are dead. And my point's been 10 years later, he obviously was wrong. They're very much alive, and they're causing us a lot of problems, and they need to be shot. So there's a little bit of context behind the gun metaphor. But the reason they need to be shot is they're frankly becoming, well, when you look at all the problems we have in cybersecurity today, passwords tend to be at the root of a lot of them. The data breach investigation report is something that Verizon puts out in partnership with the U.S. Secret Service and a bunch of other law enforcement agencies around the world every year. The report from 2013 pointed out that 76% of network intrusions were tied to exploiting different weaknesses of passwords. 76%. That basically means that it's an anomaly these days when you hear about a big breach in the news or something happens that you haven't heard of, and exploiting the weakness of a password wasn't actually tied to that. And this can be everything from people simply leaving admin passwords as admin, or consumers using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to more sophisticated attacks like spear phishing that forces you to give up a password, or injecting malware onto a computer that can capture all of your keystrokes, which means you might have a 20-character password with uppercase and lowercase and symbols and numbers, but if malware is capturing that, then they simply have the keys to the castle from there. Adding that second factor, being able to bring in other layers beyond just a password, makes an exponential difference in terms of actually making security improvements. In 2005, when the Defense Department, who was the first government agency to start rolling out these smart cards that have several digital certificates, mandated that you could only log in with these cards and the certificates on them, backed up by a PIN as a second factor, and you couldn't use passwords, they found their network intrusions dropped about 46% virtually overnight, which is a pretty stunning number because that shows exactly how many of the hacks that they had were tied to that. Now, that's great for military-grade encryption. This may not be good for my mom in the suburbs of Detroit on her iPad logging into her bank, her doctor's office, Amazon, mymedicare.gov. But I think a lot of what we'd like to do is be able to take the power that's in these cards and bring them into other form factors that will be more palatable to consumers, and you can actually get them to use them. Beyond the security side, I think passwords have simply become unusable. The Wall Street Journal article I was quoted in talked about a professor at MIT who I think was ashamed to say he was credited with inventing the first password. And the reason was, back in the days of mainframe computers, people had to share them, and so you needed a way to actually manage access to this mainframe that all these researchers wanted to get to. And I think he pointed out one of his colleagues implemented the first hack when he stole somebody else's password and got some extra time on the mainframe to run his equations. But we're now here, 40, 45 years later, and most of us are managing 25 or 30 passwords in our personal life. The guidance we get is make them all 12 characters, uppercase, lowercase, symbols, numbers. Don't write any of them down. Don't make any of them the same. It's completely unusable. It's a security model that's just built for failure, and it's one reason why a lot of people don't bother to do anything more than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or they'll reuse good passwords across multiple sites, which leads to other issues, is that they're just kind of giving up. We haven't given them anything from a security perspective that actually meets their needs. So one of the big drivers of NSTIC, certainly not the only one, is how do we finally put a bullet in the password, or at least come up with some easy solutions to augment them so that we have better security and better usability and better privacy along with it.
So you've outlined this broad vision of the future. You've outlined why the current system is terrible. I'm ready to sign up. When will this thing be? What's taking time? Why is this difficult to do?
So it's really hard to do. In fact, a lot of folks who have been around the internet a long time, some will argue this is the hardest thing to solve. It's one reason why we're here today in 2014, where every aspect of our computing experience, from back in the mainframe days has changed. I mean, I look at this, this mobile thing I have in my pocket and all the horsepower it has and the vibrant display and, all the great, wireless broadband that I get, but I still have to go enter a password almost every site I go to transact business. It's failed, I think, not necessarily because of technology, but actually because of other issues. There's been, when you start talking about actually having a credential that would be better, that other sites would accept, you start to run into a bit of a trust gap. For one thing, the lawyers come in and say, well, wait, if we're accepting this credential and it gets compromised and we get sued, who's liable? We've certainly seen past, it's not the first time that the government or private sector, have actually tried to make progress on replacing passwords or supporting federated identity. We have seen beyond just the liability issue, some of the broader business issues in terms of, hey, what's the economic model for this? What do I actually pay for a credential? What do I pay if I'm using it? Who actually, there's got to be some money in it, right? Those business models haven't been worked out particularly well. Privacy concerns have been really big. When you start talking about some of the data that can actually be tied to credentials, personal attributes about people, if you don't have rules of the road, you can get in some trouble yourself, and it's hard to inspire confidence among consumers. I think it's one of the things we've seen, not to single out Facebook, but one of the evolutions we've seen them make in their Facebook Connect product over the last couple of years is they went from 2 or 3 years ago, in order to connect with Facebook, you'd have to share all sorts of information about yourselves just to not create a password. Now they announced a few weeks ago they'll actually let you choose what attributes you can share or even support anonymous login. Things like that are exciting for us to see because we think that might help to inspire more consumers to buy into the concept of a password replacement, and I think they're making that for some very sound business decisions as well. And usability has been a big issue. I held up my card before, and man, I love it working for NIST. I log in every day, I digitally sign all sorts of stuff. My office is downtown at the Commerce Department. The NIST mothership is up in Gaithersburg, which means for all the stuff I have to sign, managing a staff of like a dozen people, if I had to print it out and do it on paper and shuttle it back and forth, we'd kill a couple of trees a year and waste a lot of time. I digitally sign everything. In the consumer space, when you've actually asked consumers to carry a dongle or a card, they've generally rejected it. And I think one thing that we've seen is you can't just sell security, you have to sell an experience that's more elegant, more simple, really gives the consumer value if you want them to start changing their practices online. So all of these have been barriers. I think what we've been doing to address it has really been trying to, one, identify them and find consensus on them among our broader set of stakeholders. There's a big organization, the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group, that we help stand up with the private sector that is basically formed in support of NSTIC to try and help this whole vision of what's dubbed an identity ecosystem be realized. And we're actually having our next plenary up at NIST. We're hosting it for a change. We usually go other places around the country, but June 17th to 19th, and you're all welcome to come. It's free. You just got to register online beforehand. But trying to work through some of these issues and actually put some frameworks in place. A lot of this can be solved by standards, both on the technical side and the policy side. Doing some pilots that make use of the standards and support them and demonstrate the value proposition, having the government start to be an early adopter of this promise, of this premise, and demonstrating the promise of the technology. All of these are things that can start to collectively swirl around and start to catalyze a marketplace that we don't have today.
This morning we heard from Peter Schaaf in Germany a little about some of the situation in Europe. Are there countries that have done similar kinds of things successfully? What are some of the other models?
So we've seen, NSTIC, I describe it sometimes as a distinctly American model, which might not be so accurate. Now, there are some other countries that are also working in partnership with the private sector to address identity, but it's one that I think is distinctly American in that Americans have long rejected the concept of a national ID card. The traditional response in Europe to digital identity has been the government will simply give you a card and you'll use it every place you go. And from our perspective, those programs, there's some that have been more successful than others, but they've largely, where they've had success, it's been in the government space where you present the same card every place. Actually getting private sector parties to actually accept those credentials has been a really tough slog for a lot of the countries, in part because I think for some of the same reasons we see here, they start asking, how can I trust this? What are the implications of using a government credential? There's a whole bunch of issues that are sort of left unresolved. And in Germany, certainly, we've actually, we just hosted a delegation from the German National ID program about a month ago. And one of the things they've talked about is while they've enabled citizens in Germany to essentially turn on a container for electronic authentication, and they're opening it up to all of their retailers and other businesses in Germany, the uptake, both from consumers and particularly from businesses, has been almost non-existent, in part because they're running into some tricky issues. And so, from our perspective, one, I looked at them and I said, well, at least we're in the same place right now without spending a couple $100 billion on a national ID card program. But from our perspective, we don't think the government needs to be the issuer of what Americans use to log in online. In fact, we think that's a bad idea. There may be ways that the government can play a role in helping with it, whether it's from NIST playing a role in voluntary consensus bodies for standards and trying to drive standards forward, or we're seeing some pilots where the DMV or the Postal Service are playing a role in in-person identity proofing. So once you establish that you really are who you say you are, how can those attributes then be asserted online on your behalf so that you can identify yourself more places online? For example, if you want to access your electronic health records, the other site may want to know to a reasonable level of assurance that you actually are who you claim to be and are not just somebody with your username and password on any given day. What we have seen as well is a number of countries, both national ID focused, as well as others, trying to look, to what we're doing, and we actually collaborate quite a bit. We've, a couple times a year, we have sort of a fledgling group of about 10 countries that get together for what we call an International Identity Summit, government only for a couple days, just talking about lessons learned, experiences from different efforts. Over in the UK, they've launched an effort called the Identity Assurance Program that's actually very, very similar to NSTIC. It's probably our closest sibling in terms of what I'd look at, going on around the world. And they're doing some things very different than us and some very the same, but having some good initial successes from what we've seen.
One of perhaps the most ambitious of all these national projects is in India, which is doing iris scans on 1 billion people. It's theoretically voluntary according to the description of the program. Is there any insights from that program that are interesting from your
India, I find it's a fascinating thing to watch from afar, if for nothing else, and as somebody who was involved in biometrics in an earlier career. The scale issues that they're actually testing are really fascinating. I mean, biometrics, one of the issues is, okay, so you're looking at unique data points on people, but you do get to a certain number when you start to run out of unique data points. The U.S. Visit program, which is used, as part of our border control, our entry, originally was deployed with 2 fingerprints until they hit about 90 million people, and they started to realize that the number of unique data points that you're going to get from 2 fingers is actually pretty limited, and they had to go all the way to 10. When you start talking about a biometric system that's going to scale to over 1 billion people, nobody's done it before. And I'm sort of watching, almost from my curiosity is almost academic to see, does it work? Is it even feasible? Beyond that, I would say there's not really a lot of similarities. It's a classic national ID program. It's just one that's being done on a scale and scope that far surpasses, what we've seen anyplace else. But it's completely opposite of what we're trying to do here, which is to create a marketplace where people can choose their own way that they'd prefer to actually manage their identities online.
So in the United States, businesses right now have a pretty free hand as to what data they collect and how they collect it in the login process and the registration and so on. Have you found resistance to your ideas because of this free hand that they get, which is often useful for gathering consumer information?
Yes. We always point out NSTIC is voluntary. And something I talk about quite a bit when I'm asked how we're doing is looking at what this thing is, which is a strategy. So, before I got into the identity space, I was a political science major a long time ago at the University of Michigan, and I remember I learned a lot about legislation and how you can make things happen that way, and regulation, and even executive orders. We never learned about strategy back in Ann Arbor. And the reason is, it isn't actually, it's a little secret, it's not actually anything that means much. It's the NSIC at the end of the day is a really well-written document that was signed by the president, and certainly there's some oomph that comes with that. But it's all carrot and no stick. It essentially, lays out a compelling vision where we've succeeded in getting a lot of companies, although some have chosen not to participate, in part because of some of these concerns that you raised on it. It may actually limit some of their business practices around data. But we've been able to rally a really, great coalition of big companies and advocates and academics and governments all together who think this is the right direction to go in, and they're working together. But there are some big names that aren't at the table. And I don't think that's overly surprising. But what has been nice to see is, I also point out, certainly to our steering group, when they say, man, we've really got to get X company here. Well, they may not want to show up at a steering group meeting, but that doesn't mean that they're not engaging with us or other stakeholders, or even if they say they don't like the NSIC, that doesn't mean they're not paying attention to it. We feel like one of the best things that we're able to do, both from our office as well as leveraging the White House, is gives us a bit of a bully pulpit to actually be talking about what identity and authentication solutions ought to be doing online, and what rights people should have when it comes to their privacy, how you should be setting default protections around collection of data and use of it, that whether you like it or not, it's still something that you have to pay attention to. I mentioned Facebook before and some of the changes they're made. They haven't participated in NSTIC at all, other than we've talked to them. And while I can't claim credit for any of the changes that they announced a few weeks ago, I can tell you we were excited to see them because it looks a lot more like what we asked them to consider doing a few years ago. So I do think, how do I say it? A lot of conversations we have with companies too, they tend to be focused on their quarterly results, and so they're looking 3, 6, maybe 12 months ahead. And the notion of changing the way that they're actually collecting data is something that will freak them out in some cases, because they see it, they only see the downside in the change. But I think what we're seeing over the long term is companies are starting to realize that there is actually upside and perhaps new economic value in actually empowering individuals to have more control over their information and their data. This notion that a lot of firms have of all of your data is ours and we're just going to collect it, buy it, sell it, swap it, may sort of be where we're in the market today. But one thing I talk about, and this is I think it'd be foolish to say that just because that's where we're at right now, that's where we're going to be for the rest of time. And there's I think a lot of firms who are a little bit more enlightened might be too strong a word, but I think there's a lot of firms and organizations that are out there that recognize that by actually giving the individual much more say in what is done with their data, they actually may be able to derive more economic value from that data than if they just collect it without asking, or doing it through some 40-page privacy policy that doesn't make anything clear to anybody.
How long do you think it'll be before there is this wide adoption of the systems that you're talking about? Is it a question of months, of years, a question of when your hair turns completely gray? How long?
Grayer, by the way, since I started this job. I think it's going to take some time. I think you're basically starting with a great vision that's backed up by the White House, and we've got by the way, it's not just that, we get some money from Congress every year too to support the steering group and our office and pilots and other things in government. I think it's something that will be slow to evolve, but the way I look at it is every year we sort of look back at where we were 12 months ago, and we're very excited about where we're going. A lot of the problem has really been when you talk about these federated identity solutions, they've always been hamstrung by the old chicken and egg problem. If I'm a consumer, why would I bother to go to company XYZ or patient privacy rights and pay for this credential if none of the sites I do business with are going to use it? And likewise, if I'm company ABC, why would I bother to integrate with the identity solution offered by patient privacy rights if only 10,000 people carry it and I've got 50 million that visit my site every year? So one of the things we've tried to do with the pilots is get out of the chicken and egg conundrum and basically pay for some chickens and some eggs and here's where I take the metaphor a couple steps too far, but the healthy ones hatch and reproduce and grow, and pretty soon you have, a chicken farm or a poultry industry, or you can take this one where you want. But we've really been trying to strategically fund some pilots, and we're in the middle of evaluating proposals for a third round of pilots right now that can help to get out of this problem, because it's clear that, left to if you just leave the market to its own devices, they've struggled with this for a long time. They failed to overcome some of the barriers I've talked about, and they can use some help to pull things together. One of the best quotes about our pilots actually came from one of the applications we're evaluating, where I don't have it in front of me, but to paraphrase it, said, the nice thing about NSTIC and these pilot dollars, while it's not a huge sum of money in the scheme of the whole marketplace, is it served as an incentive to bring together a number of firms and organizations that might have never talked to each other, might have often just been competing with each other rather than look for ways to collaborate, and they're doing something that they wouldn't have done otherwise, which is really what we wanted the pilots to do, was to make some things happen that otherwise would not. Now, to be clear, I think we should be doing twice as much as what we're doing. We're limited by the funding that we've had, and we never have gotten our full request from the Hill relative to what the White House has asked for. But we're making good progress there. And so I think between what we're seeing with the pilots, as well as some of the things the government is actually doing for its own sites, I think 18 to 24 months from now, you should be able to, as a consumer, be able to get at least one or two credentials, someplace that you'll be able to use at a few sites. Beyond that, when does this become ubiquitous? That's a much harder thing to say. I think this is still a very early stage of the market, where we're encouraged by what we're seeing. But am I going to say this will be done in 5 years and we'll all get medals? I mean, that'd be nice. I want my ceremony to look kind of like the end of Star Wars. That'd be pretty cool if it was like that. But no, I don't think. I hesitate to put a date on it, because I think we have to first, accomplish some things in the next 18 to 24 months that are going to be foundational to then helping the marketplace expand.
I want to shortly open the floor to questions, so please think of your questions. I wanted to ask, though, before that, how does health data fit into this, in your estimation?
So health, talking about things that could accelerate this, when we look across different verticals from our office, health seems to be one that has some of the biggest need, and in some cases is the farthest behind. And I hope that's not anything too harsh to say that. But the promise of health information technology is really exciting. But when you start to get down to some of the use cases of my personal data is now going to be online, and either I or my physician or somebody else is going to be able to log in somehow and actually get access to it or share it different places, that's a really hard thing to actually make successful without solving this identity conundrum. We're 21 years next month from the New Yorker publishing the famous cartoon where the dog's typing on his computer and says to his friend the dog, the great thing about the internet is nobody knows you're a dog. And it's great that you can go online these days in some use cases and be a dog. If you're leaving really thoughtful comments at the end of somebody's blog or a news article, or there's a lot of things you can do where it doesn't matter who you are. But I think health is one of those applications. We certainly see it within the US government, where if you don't know definitively that you're really Adam and not a dog, that application's simply not going to be online. Or if it is, it's only a matter of time until something unpleasant happens, because the data is not actually really being secured. And so from our perspective, identity is something that if you can get this identity foundation of the internet solved, it opens up a whole bunch of value in terms of new applications you can do for businesses, for consumers, for government, not only in healthcare, but in a variety of different verticals. But I think health, both being in an industry that is somewhat regulated, you have a federal government that's doing quite a bit right now to try and drive adoption of electronic health records and putting some real dollars behind it. And because of the kind of data you're talking about, when you look at all of the different dossiers that are out there on me in different databases, my health information is probably some of the juiciest to somebody who wants to mess with me. And so it really suggests that we take some steps to get it right. In fact, a lot of our pilots have had a heavy healthcare nexus, in part because we think it's quite important. We should also note to collaborate quite closely with ONC on this, including more or less sharing a staff member between our two offices, Debbie Bucci, trying to make sure that we can get this right.
Let's open now to some questions, or if anyone has great solutions or insights to share. It would be best if you'd be so kind as to step up to the microphone, just so that anyone listening on the podcast could hear.
follow up on my comment about breath print analysis. Have you funded any proposals to look at breath print analyzers?
He may not have heard that he wasn't here for the breath.
You wouldn't need username or password. You just say, hi, it's me, and it knows it's you.
I'll tell you, I've been around a lot of biometrics. I've never actually heard of anybody even talking about breath print. So that's the new one.
Google 3-syllable biometric breath prints, and you'll find a variety of vendors.
Yeah. We haven't, and we've actually, more to the point, we've actually stayed away from funding pilots that focus on just one new modality. Our take's been the problems we have with authentication online aren't related to a lack of great technology, but rather the other issues around it, the frameworks for accepting credentials in an interoperable manner, the privacy foundation behind it. My general takes, where we've seen new modalities that have gotten funded. I mean, we're certainly doing some things with voice, with face, that are a small component of other pilots. But they've been, when they wrap it into a much bigger framework that actually would be repeatable, as opposed to just saying, here's a technology, this will solve all your password problems.
But you're seeing people put voice or face prints into a multi-channel identification system.
In one example, yes. But my point is, we've specifically not focused on modalities. We've had a number. I mentioned earlier, one of the focuses of our pilots has been we want to fund things to make something happen that otherwise would not. So our office's general view on this has been, when somebody comes to us and says, here's a great new idea for an authentication technology, can I please have $2 million to develop it? Our take's been, well, there's other places for that, like the venture community or traditional research grants to develop these sorts of things. We're much more interested in taking technologies that are ready for market or close to it and actually showing how they can be deployed across tens of thousands of users, not just in a single setting, but across multiple reliant parties, so that somebody might be using theirs at PayPal one day and at a hospital the next, and at a state government site the third. That's really been they've been more, I would say, holistic pilots in their approach as opposed to focusing on specific technology modes.
We've got two questions here, then one over there. Please go ahead.
Hey, hi, this is Andy Orem. There's been a certificate system on the web for a long time, which is plagued with all kinds of problems. Whether it's some random person getting a certificate that says they're Microsoft, or people just getting used to click through when they're warned about sites because administrators don't update them. So what have you learned from the certificate system? How will you avoid these things?
Boy, it's a good question. There's both a lot of good things to draw from that in terms of models that could work, as well as bad things. Certainly when people click through, raise your hand if when you get a warning that says, hey, the certificate on the site's expired, you don't just click the button and go through the site anyways. No. So this is a good question. You guys are all focused on privacy, right? So this is, and security. It's an example of a solution that probably hasn't worked as well as the creators thought it would. Usability is something we focus on quite a lot. I don't have a great answer. Other than to say it's an issue, and if it's not addressed, then the solutions that are out there probably aren't going to do all the things we hope they are.
Next question over here, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Jeremy, for the good work you do at NIST. 2 weeks ago, I was sitting where you were. It was the second annual Georgetown Cybersecurity Law Institute, and we talked a little bit about privacy, although today we didn't talk that much about cybersecurity, but you can't have cybersecurity without thinking about how to manage the information according to the requirements. How is NIST marrying up the framework and NSTIC and the ability to protect your privacy by having the ability to be assured that you are who you are, and then the issue of course, accountability and attribution. We can't hold anybody accountable for violating laws if we can't find out who they are.
Right. So the simple answer to that in terms of how we're integrating it with the cybersecurity framework, and for those who aren't familiar with the framework, it's a bit of a different topic. A little over a year ago, President Obama issued an executive order focused on critical infrastructure and directed NIST to come up with a framework to help the different critical infrastructure segments address their cybersecurity concerns. And there was a privacy component that were in there. The question of how we're integrating that with NSTIC is a simple one. Naomi Lefkowitz, who led the work on the privacy framework portion of the framework, works in our office. So she's integrated closely with it. Beyond that, one of the things that the framework actually focused on was authentication, where it didn't prescribe anything around authentication. It said this is an area we need more work, and the framework specifically pointed to the work going on in NSTIC and the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group to help develop some solutions that could be incorporated into future iterations of the framework. But one thing I will say also is that framework is focused on critical infrastructure, which is a little bit of a different focus than NSTIC, which is more of, it's a strategy for the whole country, where critical infrastructure is important, but this is also focused on consumer use cases. And not everything that's being done in the framework should necessarily be applied to what my mom's doing on her iPad. So it's an important set of issues, but the overlap is not, there's a nice Venn diagram. They don't go entirely together.
So a lot of people, just to follow on, because this is a big issue of controversy within the legal community around the standard of care and what the framework is putting out there in terms of precedent for reasonableness. And I absolutely understand the difference between critical infrastructure and other things, but I just want to highlight the fact that at the end of the day, you can't have absolute anonymity if you're going to do transactions on the internet, because you need to be able to hold someone accountable if they're breaking the law.
In some cases, it depends what you're doing. I mean, I think we're at, so getting to the anonymous or pseudonymous discussion, what NSTIC envisions is you can have a credential that, or multiple credentials that could essentially assert different attributes about you as needed or different persona. So when I'm buying something online, they may not even need to know who I am, only that I can pay and that it's legal for them to sell it to me, and they need a shipping address. If I'm engaging in a health transaction, I probably need to reveal more about myself so that the party on the other end can feel comfortable that they can actually release this data to me. If I'm commenting on Adam's blog, depending on the policies he puts in place, I could be Poochie34 instead of Jeremy Grant, and it wouldn't really matter. And so I think a lot of what we anticipate with NSTIC is, how do you have data that's revealed about yourself should be driven specifically by the business and legal requirements of the transaction, not by any arbitrary decision by the online service provider to just collect 75 different data points about you because they want to. And I think that's what we're trying to drive toward is, how do you focus more on data minimization and data only be collected for specific purposes? Or if you want to collect more data, how do you empower the consumer to actually have a say in that? I think, one thing I've pointed out, there were some people who looked at this and said, oh, this will be the end of, me having to share, data about myself different places, and these firms will be prohibited from collecting it. And we said, well, no. Actually, if you as a consumer wants to trade your data, you want to reveal more because you're getting a $5 off coupon, frankly, it could be something as meaningless as that, the government is not going to try to do anything to stop you. What we do want to ensure is that the defaults are set in a way that you don't have to do something beyond what should actually be needed for a transaction in order to get into a particular application or online site.
Adrian's been waiting patiently.
What can we learn from your experience from the governance perspective of trying to institute the strategy, as you put it? And in particular, I can't think of other places besides IDSG where fair information practice were built into the governance mechanism. And I'm wondering what your experience or what your advice is for other projects that are represented here that right now don't have, whether they're standards, whether they're interoperability issues, what can we learn from the governance mechanism that you've spent so much time working through?
With the strategy itself, mandating adherence to the FIPS and some core privacy rules, or the broader identity ecosystem steering group governance, that's a bit of a different conversation.
I mean it in the broader sense. In other words, are you aware of other equally careful with respect to FIPS governance mechanisms that are out there in other countries or in other domains? And is there something to be learned by the process, which I guess has taken a couple of years already, to try and get IDSG in this direction? So
I think when it comes to building in privacy from the start in the cybersecurity strategy, I think there's a couple lessons there, and we've seen this both with NSTIC as well as the cybersecurity framework, which is when you call it out from the start that it matters, and you force people to pay attention to it, you do some really good things. One, you make sure that it's not forgotten and then has to try and be jammed in later when people go, oh no, we forgot. Two, you're able to bring in to the table some advocates who might have ordinarily thrown grenades at the effort because they start looking at all the bad things that could happen. and they're instead willing to engage constructively at times, and it depends on the advocate, to actually help this effort succeed. And I'm somebody who, I've worked around security and privacy through most of my career. I've never personally understood the supposed tension that you have between the two, and that good privacy leads to good security and good security leads to good privacy. My take has been that most of the great conflicts we see, and this is just me personally speaking, come when somebody decides to just charge really hard down one path and consciously exclude the other. That might be a little harsh, but that's certainly what we've seen, both in other government initiatives here and around the world, as well as in stuff in the private sector. I think when you say from the start that this matters, and you make an effort to include folks from both sides, both communities and others from the start, you save yourself a lot of headaches, and you do the right thing. Now, the flip side of that, when it starts to get into the practical governance, and this is when we get into some of the work of our Identity Ecosystem Steering Group, is the advice I got from Leslie Harris from CDT when we launched NSTIC at the U.S. Chamber a little over 3 years ago was get yourself a big old squirt bottle and a huge bale of catnip, because this cat herding exercise is going to be unlike anything you've ever seen. And we've commented since then, I wish it was just cats. It's cats and orangutans and amoebas and mushrooms. It's a wild group. Our board of directors includes Adrian, Kalia Hamlin, who I think you guys heard from yesterday, and somebody from the AARP. So all folks who are great champions from the advocacy community, along with firms like LexisNexis, Oracle. Citigroup was our previous chair, Aetna, Neiman Marcus, some big companies who might not necessarily sit down and actually work with some of the other organizations that we're talking about normally. And what's great is, it's a little bit like a bad bar joke. All these folks walked into a bar and they should all agree on something. So the good news is they all agreed. The bad news is it does take longer, I think, to make progress. It's funny, when we were looking for governance models early on, one of the things that was suggested by a few different, I think, very well-meaning advocates was that we looked at what was done with the PCI standards for payment cards. And the more I looked at it, I said, well, that was an interesting story, but that has absolutely no resemblance to what we're trying to create. The PCI was basically 5 or 6 bank card organizations that all more or less had the exact same business and interests. I'm sure they all compete against each other, but they all basically were able to get together in a room and work out a standard and sort of, impose it on everybody. This is the opposite. We have about as big a tent as you can imagine. Progress moves forward, but it is slow.
So we have less than 5 minutes left. We now go into our speed round of final questioning with our last 3 questioners. Please, Deborah.
I just wanted to see if you could make it a little more real for patients in the future. So I have this card. What does that mean? I go to the doctor. That doesn't mean I have to give them my mother's maiden name and fill 99 things out. So they just know that some entity, it could be the post office, it could be a major company, it could be a bank, has issued me an ID, and they've verified that I'm me, and so they just know it's me. I don't have to do anything else, and I prove it's me. Is that how it would work in healthcare?
I think the way it's probably going to work in most settings is you won't have to fill some things out, and some things you will. For example, Clayton, do you want to know her mother's maiden name for what you guys are going to do? No. or at best, maybe. Yeah. And so I think, one thing you're talking about here is essentially choosing to trust another organization to be your agent out there who knows this information about you, who's vetted it, and then who can assert these attributes on your behalf. And I think one thing that people are struggling with in the business model is the more data they have about you that they can assert on your behalf gives you more convenience and probably gives more value to the online service providers who are going to get information there. But how much do you actually want that agent to know? And I think this is where there's a lot of work to still be figured out.
Well, yes, and my understanding, and this is what I was hoping you could explain, is at the medical practice, the only attribute they need to get from my issuer, trusted issuer, is that it's me, me, my age, whatever. But if I went, I don't know, to pick up a prescription for a controlled substance, maybe it would need to be me plus something else, driver's license information, I don't know what. But my idea was that whatever all those attributes are, only the minimal ones that would be needed for a particular transaction would be shared. So we'd be essentially having more privacy.
Yeah, and that's the idea behind it is,
Okay.
information should be shared as needed, so where there's a requirement. So, I mean, when I go to a new doctor, as I did about a month ago, did they actually need my SSN? I don't think so. I didn't fill it out, but they asked for it. Should the Postal Service, if I'm getting my trusted credential through them, assert my SSN to a healthcare provider if it's not actually needed for the transaction?
We have 2 minutes left. If we can do one very, very quick question and quick answer.
Just a comment for you to observe and comment about. You spent a lot of time talking about identity and authentication. A lot of healthcare gets around the issues of authentication and identity management by trust frameworks and being able to assert and trust within the framework, provided they all have common standards, policies, levels of certification, and stuff like that. The other side of it is authorization goes hand in hand with authentication. And where you can reduce the number of breaches with proper authentication and strength, you can reduce the impact of those breaches with proper authorization mechanisms and stuff like that.
So I agree 100%. I didn't talk about trust frameworks in part because sometimes when you're dealing with a crowd who hasn't talked about identity that much, people go, what's that? But it's really something that's at the center of a lot of what we want to do with NSTIC is how can we have more, better, broader trust frameworks that actually enable the acceptance of credentials between different entities without having to basically essentially negotiate a new agreement from scratch. And the authorization issue is an absolutely important one as well, particularly in the enterprise. So thank you.
I'm sorry that we've fallen out of time. We've run out of time now, but I wanted to thank you very much for your questions and answers today, and thank you for being here.
It's great.
All right, thanks again, guys. We're going to see if most of you are awake. We're going to shake you up a little bit. The next, we have 3 topics going on simultaneously. After the break, there's going to be a 10-minute break. So if you guys can take a look at your agendas, there are 3 topics. One is healthcare laws, U.S., state, and international perspectives, privacy and new healthcare models, and health data exchange. The third one is in this room. Okay, so if you want to stay for Corinne's panel, that's going to stay in this room. The other 2, the first one, which is called Healthcare Laws, U.S. State, and International Perspectives, that's in room 201, which is near where you guys had lunch. So if you go up the steps, just like you did for lunch, it's going to be near that room. Again, 201 is that room, and people will show you out, show you around as well. The other one called Privacy and New Healthcare Models, Cliff Baker's panel, is in room 202, also in the same area. And then just remember, right after those panels complete, there's a break, and then you'll come back here for the remainder of the sessions. Right? This was just to get you guys some exercise. So you've been sitting all day, and we want to make sure you're moving around a little bit. All right, 10-minute break, right back here in 10 minutes. Thanks.